She was cobbling together a Christmas out of withered branches and old cotton batting when the landowner knocked on the door to evict her that very same night. But he didn't expect to find 3 children looking up at him with those eyes full of a hope that would make any man question his own soul. Can you imagine the desperation of a mother who has to pretend everything will be all right when she has absolutely nothing, not even a roof guaranteed for the morning? But this story happened deep in the countryside of Tennessee in December of 1927, back when Christmas still held meanings that many have since forgotten. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. I want to know if this story will reach across the states, if it will touch hearts in the South, the North, the Midwest, in every little corner of this country. And if you also believe that a single act of kindness can completely change destinies, leave your like right now. It helps the channel grow immensely and motivates me to bring you more true stories of overcoming the odds. Green Hope Estate had borne that name since 1880, when Edward Alastair's grandfather planted the first tobacco crop in that rich clay earth that stretched over 500 acres. The buildings were solid, crafted from limestone and timber, typical of the prosperous southern farms of that era. The main house stood atop a gentle hill, with its tall windows and blue shutters that had once been painted with joy but were now peeling in silence. Scattered around were the workers' cottages, the barn, the smokehouse, the curing shed, the small but well-kept chapel, and in the back, almost hidden by the shade of the tall pines, the small cabin where Mariana Cross lived with her 3 children. Mariana was 31 years old, but she seemed to carry the weight of much more. Her face still held traces of that serene beauty that had made Vincent Cross fall madly in love 8 years ago when she was a teacher at the little schoolhouse in the village of St. Anthony, and he, a simple, itinerant carpenter fixing windows and doors at the farms. Her hazel eyes had that depth of someone who reads a lot, someone who had once dreamed of worlds beyond the Smoky Mountains. Her hands, which once held chalk and books, were now calloused from scrubbing clothes in the wash basin, from cooking on a wood stove, from sewing patches over patches. Vincent had no land, no fortune. He had only a smile that lit up any room and an exceptional talent for working wood. His hands worked miracles. He transformed rough planks into furniture that looked like works of art. Chairs that didn't wobble, tables perfectly leveled, doors that shut without a single creak. It was this talent that caught the attention of the landowner Edward Alastair in 1924, when Vincent was hired to overhaul all the woodwork at Green Hope Estate. Edward, always pragmatic and focused on efficiency, recognized value when he saw it. He offered a steady job, the house in the back, and a better wage than Vincent earned drifting from farm to farm. Mariana became pregnant for the first time at 23. Daniel was born in January of 1919, strong and healthy, with his father's alert eyes and his mother's serenity. 3 years later came Julia, sweet from her first cry, with brown curls framing an angel's face. And in June of 1926, Peter was born, the youngest, who was only 15 months old when Mariana's world collapsed completely. It was in September of 1927, on a common Thursday, that began like any other. Vincent left early to fetch lumber from the sawmill at the neighboring farm. He took the large wagon, pulled by 2 gentle mules that knew the way with their eyes closed. The sun was strong, typical of the southern Indian summer that precedes the autumn rains. Vincent whistled as he guided the animals down the dirt road that cut through the tobacco fields. Mariana remembered the whistle perfectly because she was hanging laundry on the line when he passed, waved, and smiled that smile that had won her over years ago. She waved back, balancing the basin of wet clothes on her hip, Peter tied to her back with a cloth. The accident happened on the ascent of Crossroads Ridge, where the road made a sharp curve between large boulders. No one could explain exactly what spooked the mules. Some said it was a copperhead crossing the path. Others swore they heard a dry thunderclap announcing a storm. The fact is, the animals bolted. Vincent tried to control them, pulled the reins with all his might, shouted the commands that always worked. But the mules were blind with panic. The wagons swayed violently, the wheels hit a protruding rock, and everything happened in seconds that felt like a frozen eternity. The wagon tumbled down the ravine. Vincent was thrown against the rocks. The load of heavy timber fell upon him. They found the body 3 hours later. The mules had returned alone to the farm, still attached to the broken harness, white foam on their muzzles. Edward Alastair organized a search party immediately. It was 6 men who followed the trail of churned earth and scattered wood. When they found Vincent, he was already gone. Broken neck, the men said in whispers that Mariana wasn't supposed to hear, but did. He didn't suffer. They lied with kindness. It was quick, they repeated, as if that alleviated the pain. Mariana received the news at the cabin door. Edward Alastair came personally, a rare thing for a landowner of his standing. He took off his hat, held it in his hands, searched for words that don't exist to communicate tragedy. "I am so sorry, Mrs. Mariana," he began with a voice that tried to be firm, but came out choked. "There was an accident. Your husband, Vincent, he didn't make it." The words fell like stones in her stomach. Her knees weakened, but she didn't fall. Daniel, who was 8 years old and standing beside his mother, held her hand with the strength of a little man trying to be strong. Julia started to cry without understanding why. Peter slept innocently in his makeshift crate crib. The funeral was at the estate's chapel. Vincent was buried in the village cemetery, beneath a dogwood tree that was turning red that time of year. Mariana didn't shed a tear during the entire ceremony. She stood petrified, staring at the simple wooden coffin that other carpenters had made in a hurry, because the dead do not wait. Only when they threw the first shovel of red clay over the lid did something break inside her. A deep sob rose from her chest, tore through her throat, and came out in a stifled scream that startled even the crows watching from the branches. Daniel hugged his mother, Julia clung to her skirt, and the 3 stood there forming an island of pain in the middle of that dusty cemetery. The next 3 months were automatic survival. Mariana had a little money saved, the earnings Vincent had gathered working in the last few years. It wasn't much, perhaps enough for 4 months if she pinched every penny like someone dividing crumbs. She sewed for the women of the estate, washed clothes for some of the workers, made fruit preserves that she sold in the village on Saturdays. Her hands never stopped. She woke before the sun rose, slept after midnight, and yet the money slipped through her fingers like water through stones. Food, medicine when the children got sick, kerosene for the lantern, soap, salt, flour. The needs were infinite, and the resources were shrinking frighteningly. Daniel noticed everything with that premature maturity that poverty forces upon children. He helped his mother in every way he could. He fetched water from the well, gathered firewood at the edge of the woods, watched over his siblings when Mariana needed to go out to work. The boy was only 8, but his eyes already knew responsibilities they shouldn't know. Julia, with her 5 years, tried to help in her own way. She swept the dirt floor of the cabin, organized the few plates and pots, sang to Peter when the baby cried. And Peter, at 15 months, was still too small to understand that his father would never return, that life had turned upside down, that hunger sometimes squeezed the belly, even when his mother said they had eaten enough. Edward Alastair didn't charge rent for the cabin during those 3 months. It was his silent way of helping. But in mid-December, reality knocked on his door like an impatient creditor. He had hired a new family of workers who would arrive in the first week of January. The man was an experienced foreman, coming with a wife and 4 children. They would need exactly that cabin, which was the largest among those available. Edward thought, rethought, lost nights of sleep over the decision. He was not a man of sentimentality, at least not for many years. The farm was a business. Business needed workers. Workers needed housing. The logic was as crystal clear as spring water. But there was something about that widow that disturbed Edward in a way he couldn't name. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity with which she carried her grief. Perhaps it was the way she never asked for a favor or whimpered for pity. Perhaps it was simply the fact that he saw in her a distant reflection of another woman who had also been widowed young, his own mother decades ago, when his father died of yellow fever, leaving her with 3 small children to raise. Edward was only 7 when that happened, but he remembered the strength his mother needed to have, the courage she showed every day until she managed to get the family back on its feet. He remembered and, remembering, felt something uncomfortable tighten his hardened chest. On December 20th, 1927, Edward made the decision. He summoned Marianne to the porch of the main house. It was late afternoon, the sun dipping behind the mountains, painting the sky in orange and purple that announced good weather for the next day. Marianne walked up the stone path with a racing heart, because a summons from the boss rarely meant good news. She wiped her hands on her worn apron, smoothed her hair tied in a simple bun, took a deep breath before knocking on the door. Edward received her formally. He offered a chair, but she preferred to stand. "Mrs. Marianne," he began, looking at the horizon because it was easier than looking into her eyes, "I need to speak about the cabin where you are living." Marianne felt the ground slip from under her feet, but maintained her composure. "I know, Mr. Edward," she replied with a firm voice. "I imagined this day would come. I am prepared." Edward finally looked at her and saw something that completely disarmed him, that unshakable dignity even in the face of the abyss. He continued explaining that a new family would arrive in January, that they would need the house, that she would have until December 25th to vacate the property. Marianne didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't shed a tear. She only asked politely if she could have until the morning of the 26th, so the children could have Christmas in that place they still considered home. Edward felt something strange pierce his chest. "Of course," he agreed quickly. "Until the morning of the 26th, then. If you need help transporting your things, I can make a wagon available." Marianne thanked him with a nod, turned, and walked down the stone path with her back straight and shoulders that only trembled when she was certain no one else could see. That night, Marianne sat on the edge of the bed she shared with Julia and Peter, while Daniel slept on the thin mattress on the floor beside them. She looked at her sleeping children, angelic faces illuminated by the dim light of the oil lamp. Julia hugged a rag doll that Marianne herself had sewn. Daniel had a protective arm over his little brother. Peter sucked his thumb, making that soft noise of a satisfied baby. Marianne felt a wave of love so intense it physically hurt. How was she going to protect these children? Where would they go? She had no family. Her parents had disowned her when she married Vincent against their wishes, and even if she wanted to return with her tail between her legs, they had died of the Spanish flu in 1919. She had no siblings, no close cousins, no one in the world besides those 3 creatures who depended completely on her. In the 4 days that followed, Marianne sought alternatives with a desperation she didn't show on her face. She went to the village to talk to Reverend Justin, a kind man but without resources. He promised to ask around the county if anyone needed a maid who could live in with her children. She went to the house of Ms. Amelia, the estate's cook, a 62-year-old woman who had always been kind. Ms. Amelia cried with pity, but couldn't offer a solution. She lived in a tiny room at the back of the main house's kitchen. She barely fit there herself. Marianne went to Gerald's general store and asked discreetly if he knew of any place to rent cheaply. Mr. Gerald scratched his grey head and said everything was occupied, that December was harvest time and all the houses were full of temporary workers. On the morning of December 24th, Christmas Eve, Marianne woke up with the weight of condemnation on her chest. That would be the last full day they would have in that cabin. She had wrapped the few belongings they possessed, some clothes, old pots, patched blankets, the books she had brought from her previous life as a teacher and couldn't bear to part with, even knowing they were useless weight. Everything fit into 2 worn leather suitcases and 3 cloth bundles. A whole life reduced to this. The children were restless because it was Christmas Eve, a date that still held magic, even in poverty. Daniel and Julia vaguely remembered previous Christmases when their father was still alive, when there was a simple but plentiful supper, when they received small gifts that Vincent made with his own hands, wooden horses, rag dolls, painted tops. Marianne knew she had no way to give them anything this year. She had no money for special food, let alone presents, but she decided she would do something, anything, to create a good memory in what could be the last Christmas they would have a roof over their heads. She went out with Daniel in the morning, and they went to the edge of the woods surrounding the farm. They gathered dry pine branches, holly leaves that smelled strong and fresh, moss that grew on the damp stones. They returned loaded down, and Marianne set up a rustic arrangement in a corner of the cabin, trying to create the appearance of a Christmas tree, like she had seen in rich houses when she was still a teacher. She used old cotton batting she found in the back of a drawer and spread it among the branches, trying to simulate snow, even knowing that snow was something that rarely fell in those Tennessee hills. Julia clapped her hands, enchanted. "It looks real, Mama," exclaimed the girl with those eyes shining with innocent joy. Marianne had saved flour and a little brown sugar. In the afternoon she made simple cookies, just flour, water, sugar, and a pinch of salt, baked on a makeshift sheet over the wood stove. They weren't the rich fruitcakes soaked in bourbon made in the wealthy houses, nor the roast turkey the farmers ate, but it was what she had, and she put all the love in the world into those crooked cookies. The sweet smell filled the tiny cabin, and for a few moments it seemed that everything would be all right. Daniel helped his mother mold a nativity scene with clay they fetched near the creek. They made rough but recognizable figures: Joseph, Mary, baby Jesus, the 3 wise men, some animals. Julia painted everything with charcoal from the stove and a remnant of red paint they found in a forgotten pot. It was disproportionate and primitive, but it had the honest beauty of something made with the heart. They placed the nativity scene near the makeshift tree. Peter, who was starting to take wobbly steps, was fascinated with the figures, picking them up and putting them down, making satisfied baby noises. When the sun began to descend, dyeing the sky that golden color that precedes twilight, Marianne lit the single candle they had. It was a thick tallow candle, the kind that lasted a long time but made dark smoke and a strong smell. She placed it in the center of the rustic table, and the flickering light created dancing shadows on the timber walls. Daniel held the candle with religious care, as if it were a sacred object. Julia hummed Silent Night, off-key but moving. Peter clapped his chubby little hands. And Marianne, looking at that scene of absolute poverty, illuminated by infinite love, felt tears finally flow down her face, which had remained dry for 3 whole months. It was at that exact moment that there was a knock on the door. 3 firm, dry knocks that echoed in the silence of that Christmas Eve like a final sentence. Marianne wiped her tears quickly, smoothed her apron, took a deep breath. She knew who it was. She opened the door and found Edward Alistair standing on the threshold, hat in his hands and a closed expression that revealed nothing. The landowner was 43 years old and looked every one of them. His face was angular, marked by lines that came more from worries than from smiles. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, the kind that seemed to see right through people. His graying hair was slicked back with pomade. He wore a dark suit even in the mild December weather, because Edward Alistair was a man of formalities, of appearances maintained, of distances preserved. "Good evening, Mrs. Marianne," he said in a gravelly voice. "I came to verify if you are preparing to leave the house tomorrow. Did you manage to find a place to go?" The words were direct, practical, but there was something in the tone that wasn't exactly cold. Perhaps it was discomfort, perhaps embarrassment masked as efficiency. Marianne kept her composure. "Good evening, Mr. Edward. Yes, we are preparing. We will leave the house in the morning as agreed. You need not worry." She didn't answer about having found a place because lying wasn't in her nature, and the truth was too heavy to carry out loud. Edward noticed the omission. "And where are you going?" The question came out more abrupt than he intended. Marianne hesitated, looked back where the children were watching the scene with those big, frightened eyes. "I will find a way, Mr. Edward," she answered vaguely. "One always finds a way." Edward followed her gaze, and that was when he saw the complete scene for the first time. The miserable cabin, illuminated by a single flickering candle. The dry branches decorated with old cotton trying to be a Christmas tree. The crude clay nativity set that was still damp. The poorly baked cookies lined up on a cracked plate, and the 3 children. Daniel, with his 8 years, holding the candle like someone holding on to the last hope. Julia, with her 5 years, hugging the worn rag doll. Peter, with his 15 months, looking at him with innocent curiosity, not knowing that this man was responsible for taking them out of there. Something pierced Edward Alistair in that moment. It was as if a dam he had carefully built over 10 years suddenly cracked, letting leak feelings he had sworn never to allow again. The scene before him was a cruel and perfect mirror of a memory buried deep. His wife, Cecily, 9 months pregnant, trying to prepare Christmas of 1916, while he was traveling resolving business in Nashville. When he returned 3 days later, he found her dead in childbirth, and their stillborn son wrapped in a white blanket. The doctor explained complications, hemorrhage. There was no time. Edward never celebrated Christmas again. He closed the rooms where Cecily had lived, locked away the memories, built walls around his heart. But now, looking at Marianne and her 3 children on that Christmas Eve of 1927, the walls trembled. He saw Cecily in that mother, trying to create joy where there was none. He saw the son he never knew in that baby with curious eyes. He saw the life he lost reflected in the life he was about to destroy out of simple commercial pragmatism. "The children are beautiful," Edward said suddenly, and his own voice sounded strange to his ears, softer than he intended. Marianne blinked in surprise. "Thank you, Mr. Edward," she replied, not knowing exactly how to react. "They are my whole life." Edward looked at her, and for the first time really saw. He saw the woman beyond the problematic widow he needed to evict. He saw the intelligent eyes that had read much, the tired but dignified face, the calloused hands of one who works without complaining, the straight spine of one who doesn't bow even when everything conspires to break her. "How old is the eldest?" The question came out unplanned. "Daniel is 8, Marianne replied. "Julia turned 6 in February. Peter completed a 1.5 years in June." Edward did the math mentally. The eldest was born in 1919. If his own child had survived, he would be a few years older. But looking at that boy, holding the candle with such seriousness, the thought ached physically. "Do you have children, Mr. Edward?" Marianne's question was gentle, an attempt to fill the uncomfortable silence that had settled. Edward felt the stab. "No," he replied dryly. "I don't." There was a loaded pause. "I did," he corrected with a voice that was almost a whisper. "But he didn't survive the birth, neither did my wife." Marianne felt immediate compassion. "I am so sorry," she said sincerely. "That must have been terrible." Edward just nodded, incapable of words. They stood there on the doorstep, two widowed souls marked by irreparable losses, while Christmas night fell over the Tennessee mountains, bringing a cooler temperature and a starry sky that seemed eternal. "I will leave you in peace," Edward said finally. "Enjoy the evening. Tomorrow we will resolve this." He turned to leave, but Julia, with that devastating innocence of small children, ran up to him. "Mr. Edward," the girl called with a sweet little voice, "do you want a cookie? My mama made them for Christmas." Edward looked down and saw the child extending a crooked cookie, offering it with a smile that knew no malice or calculation. Something inside him, something that had been frozen for a decade, began to thaw. He knelt slowly, getting to the girl's height. "Thank you, young lady," he said, taking the cookie with care, as if it were a precious object. "That is very kind of you." Julia smiled even wider. "It's Christmas," she explained with simple logic. "At Christmas, we share what we have." Edward bit into the cookie. It was dry, hard, practically flavorless beyond flour and burnt sugar. It was probably the worst cookie he had ever eaten in his life. But it was also, in some strange and inexplicable way, the best. "It is delicious," Edward lied, looking at Julia but speaking loud enough for Mariana to hear. Julia vibrated with happiness. "I helped make it," she said proudly. "I mixed the dough." Edward smiled. It was a small smile, rusty from disuse, but genuine. "You did an excellent job then," he praised. The girl ran back to her mother, telling her excitedly that Mr. Edward had liked the cookies. Edward stood up, now holding the rest of the cookie like someone holding a relic. He looked at Mariana, who had tears shining in her eyes, but didn't let them fall. "Good night, Mrs. Mariana," he said. "Good night to the children too." He turned and walked down the dark path back to the main house, and Mariana stood at the door, watching until he disappeared into the darkness. Inside the cabin, Daniel asked softly if the landowner had come to evict them. Mariana took a deep breath. "I don't know, my son," she answered honestly. "I don't know what will happen tomorrow, but today is Christmas, and today we will celebrate what we have." She closed the door, returned to her children, and they began a modest supper with crooked cookies and fresh water from the well. Julia sang Silent Night again, this time with less off-key notes. Daniel told a story he was inventing about the wise men traveling through the desert. Peter fell asleep in his mother's lap with a smile on his lips. Edward Alistair returned to the main house walking slowly, like someone who doesn't want to arrive. The residence was enormous, 12 rooms, 2 parlours, a formal dining room, an office, a library, all furnished with expensive pieces, Persian rugs, imported crystal chandeliers, and all completely empty of life. He entered through the main door, walked down the hallway with portraits of ancestors staring severely from the walls, and arrived at the sitting room where he spent his evenings. Ms. Amelia, the cook, had left dinner ready as always. Roast chicken with potatoes, tomato and onion salad, fresh bread, wine from the bottle he opened little by little during the week. All much better than burnt cookies and well water. Edward sat at the table alone, served himself, and began to eat mechanically. The flavor didn't reach him. He thought of the eyes of that girl offering the cookie, of the baby with curious eyes, of the boy too mature for his age, of the mother who didn't cry even when she had every right to collapse. He ate half the plate and gave up. He got up, went to the office, sat in the leather armchair where he usually read before sleeping, but he couldn't concentrate on any book. The image of that destitute family trying to have a decent Christmas wouldn't leave his mind. He remembered Cecily decorating the entire main house at Christmas of 1916, pregnant and radiant, hanging pine garlands, arranging an expensive Neapolitan nativity scene they had bought on a trip to New York, smiling with that joy that lit up everything. Edward grabbed a bottle of brandy he kept for special occasions, but there were never special occasions, not anymore. He poured a generous dose, drank it in one go, felt the liquid burn down his throat. He poured another dose, and another. He tried to drown the discomfort, the guilt, the memory, the conscience that insisted on screaming that he was about to put 3 innocent children on the street the morning after Christmas. What was the alternative? The question echoed in his mind, seeking justification. He had a commitment to the new foreman. He had given his word. He had a business to run, a farm to manage, workers to house. He couldn't simply change everything out of sentimentality. On the other hand, argued another voice in his head, a voice that sounded suspiciously like his late mother's. He owned 500 acres of land, had a house with 12 empty rooms, had enough resources to help without even feeling the difference in his pocket. The real question wasn't if he could help, but if he wanted to. And that was the question Edward Allister wasn't prepared to answer. Helping meant getting involved. Getting involved meant caring. Caring meant opening doors he had locked with care 10 years ago. It meant risking feeling again, and feeling hurts, feeling bleeds, feeling kills. It was much safer to keep distance, maintain control, keep the heart locked in ice where pain couldn't reach, but neither could joy. He drank one more dose of brandy. The wall clock marked 10 at night. Outside, distant fireworks could be heard. Neighbors celebrating Christmas Eve. Laughter drifted from the workers' quarters where they were having a modest party. Life happened around him. But Edward sat alone in a dark house, drinking, to forget the image of 3 children and a mother who had dignity when she should have had despair. At midnight, the chapel bells rang announcing Christmas. Edward heard the slow and solemn tolls. He imagined Mariana and the children hearing the same bells, perhaps kneeling in prayer, perhaps simply hugged together, trying to sleep on the last Christmas they would have a roof. He imagined the next morning, them gathering their miserable bundles, walking out the farm gate with no destination, walking down the dirt road while the sun burned, and the baby cried, and the boy tried to be strong, and the girl didn't understand where they were going. Edward stood up abruptly. He began to pace from one side to the other in the office, like a caged animal. He stopped in front of Cecily's portrait that he kept on the desk. She smiled in the photograph, beautiful at 28. Dark hair tied in an elegant bun, a light lace dress, a pearl necklace that had been a birthday gift. "What would you do, Cecily?" Edward asked aloud to the portrait. "What would you tell me if you were here?" He knew the answer. Cecily had a huge heart, generous to the point of recklessness. She helped anyone who knocked on the door asking for food, work, alms. Edward sometimes complained that she was being taken advantage of, that people exploited her kindness. She just laughed and said she preferred to be fooled 10 times than to deny help once to someone who really needed it. "Edward," Cecily used to say, holding his face between her hands, "you have a good heart, but you hide it with that serious face. One day you will learn that being vulnerable isn't a weakness." He never learned that lesson. After she died, he became even more closed off, harder, more distant. He built a reputation as a fair but inflexible farmer. He paid well, but demanded perfection. He helped when obliged by law or basic morality, but not an inch beyond. He was respected, but not loved. Feared, but not admired. And now, alone in a dark office at 2 in the morning on Christmas, Edward Allister needed to decide what kind of man he really was. The house was in absolute silence. Only the ticking of the clock marked the passage of time. Edward looked out the window in the direction where the cabin sat in the back. He couldn't see it from there. It was hidden by the pines, but he knew exactly where it was. He imagined Mariana awake too, perhaps sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at her sleeping children, planning what to do when the sun rose and there was no more roof, no more protection, no more anything. They were the 3 longest hours of Edward Allister's life. He thought of his mother facing widowhood with 3 small children. He thought of Cecily and the son who never breathed. He thought of all the Christmases of his childhood when he still believed in goodness, generosity, the Christmas spirit. He thought of the man he used to be versus the man he had become. And he thought more than anything of that 5-year-old girl offering a crooked cookie, saying that at Christmas we share what we have. At 5 in the morning, with the sky starting to lighten on the horizon line, Edward made a decision. It wasn't a rational, calculated, logical decision. It was a decision of the heart, of that heart he had tried to kill, but remained stubbornly alive beneath all the layers of protection. He got up, washed his face in the china basin, combed his hair, put on clean clothes. He went down to the kitchen where Miss Amelia was already awake preparing coffee because she always woke up early, even on holidays. "Miss Amelia," Edward said, entering the kitchen, "I need you to prepare a basket with food, plenty of food, ham, eggs, milk, cheese, flour, beans, rice, whatever is best in the pantry." The cook looked surprised. "For whom, Mr. Edward?" "For Mrs. Marianne and her children," he replied. "And get good blankets from the linen closet, the wool ones stored in the hallway armoire. And candles, get 6 good candles, and firewood, arrange some dry firewood." Miss Amelia started to smile. "All right, Mr. Edward," she agreed, trying to hide the joy in her voice. "I'll prepare everything." Edward left the kitchen before she asked questions. He crossed the yard, still dark, passed by the workers' housing where some were already starting to wake up, followed the path leading to the cabin in the back. The sky was purple with streaks of pink announcing the sunrise. Birds were starting to sing. The air was fresh with that smell of damp earth from the dew. It was Christmas morning of 1927, and Edward Alastair walked decisively toward a decision that would change his life completely. But when he was 50 yards from the cabin, he saw movement. The door opened, and Marianne came out carrying Peter in her arms. Daniel came behind, pulling one of the leather suitcases. Julia held the rag doll with one hand and a small bundle of clothes with the other. They were leaving. They were fulfilling the agreement, leaving the house on the morning of the 26th, or rather the 25th, as she felt compelled to leave early, as agreed. Marianne had put on her best dress, which was worn but clean and ironed with care. Her hair was tied in a bun. She walked with a straight spine, head held high, even having nowhere to go. Edward stopped where he was, partially hidden by the trunk of a large pine. He watched the scene. Marianne put Peter on the ground, went back to fetch another suitcase. Daniel helped carrying too much weight for an 8-year-old boy, but doing it without complaint. Julia hummed softly, perhaps to keep herself cheerful. They gathered their poor belongings there in front of the cabin, a pathetic pile that represented a whole life. Marianne looked back one last time. She looked at the miserable cabin that had been home for 3 years. She saw the tree of dry branches through the window, the clay nativity scene they were leaving behind because it was too heavy to carry. She took a deep breath, held Daniel's hand, picked Peter up again in her arms, and began to walk down the dirt path toward the farm gate. Julia followed alongside, stumbling a little, because the bundle was big for her. It was when Edward stepped out from behind the pine tree. "Wait!" he called out. His voice came out louder than he intended, echoing in the morning silence. Marianne stopped immediately, turned around startled. She saw the landowner walking toward them with long, decisive strides. Her heart raced. She thought he was coming to collect something, complain about something, hurry their exit. She prepared herself for more humiliation with that dignity that was already armor. But when Edward got close, Marianne saw something different in his face. The closed, hard expression he always wore was broken. The dark eyes held something akin to... Was it possible that it was emotion? "You aren't going anywhere," Edward said, and the words came out half trembling, half firm, as if he were fighting with himself at every syllable. "Take your things and go back to the cabin." Marianne blinked, confused. "But Mr. Edward, you said—" she began. "I know what I said," interrupted Edward, "and I was wrong. You are staying, at least until you find a better place, and when you find it, I will help you move properly." The silence that followed was broken only by the bird song and the gentle wind in the pine needles. Daniel squeezed his mother's hand tightly. Julia looked at Edward with those big eyes. Peter started to whimper, wanting to get down. Marianne felt her legs weaken. "Mr. Edward," she whispered because her voice wouldn't come out, "I don't know what to say. You don't have to." "I don't have to," agreed Edward, "but I want to. Or perhaps I need to in ways I don't understand yet." He looked at the children, then back to Marianne. "Go back to the cabin. Miss Amelia is preparing a basket with food. I will send blankets and firewood, and we will talk later about a proper job for you on the estate, something that pays better and allows you to care for the children." Tears finally streamed down Marianne's face, all those tears she had held back for 3 whole months. "Thank you," she said between sobs. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." She couldn't stop thanking him. Edward nodded uncomfortably, not used to such visceral gratitude. "No need to thank me," he murmured. "Just Merry Christmas, Mrs. Marianne." "Merry Christmas, Mr. Edward," replied Marianne, smiling through the tears. Julia ran up to him and hugged his leg tightly. Edward stood paralyzed for a second, not knowing how to react. Then, slowly, awkwardly, he placed a large, heavy hand on the girl's hair. "Merry Christmas, young lady," he said with a husky voice, "and I liked your cookies very much, young lady." Julia ran back to her mother, telling her excitedly that the landowner had liked the cookies. Edward stood there a few more seconds, looking at that family improvising Christmas with nothing but love and hope. Then he turned and walked down the dark path back to the main house, and while he walked, the crooked cookie still in his hand, something inside him began to change in a way he didn't fully comprehend yet. That night, alone in his empty mansion, Edward couldn't sleep thinking of the eyes of that child, offering what she had, of the mother trying to create magic where there were no resources, of the innocent baby who didn't know the world was about to collapse. And at 5 in the morning, he made the decision that would change everything. The days that followed that Christmas of 1927 brought changes that no one at Greenhope Estate expected, especially not Edward Alastair himself. The decision he had made in that early morning, moved by an impulse that defied years of self-imposed protection, proved to be only the first step of a journey much longer and more transformative than he imagined. On the morning following Christmas, Edward kept his word with the efficiency that always characterized his business dealings. He had Miss Amelia prepare not just 1 basket, but 3 generous baskets of food that would last for weeks. He sent 2 workers to carry dry, well-cut firewood sufficient for the winter that still had 2 months ahead. From the closets of the main house, he brought wool blankets that had been stored since Cecily died, expensive warm blankets that had never warmed anyone since. But it was the conversation about employment that really changed everything. Edward called Marianne to the porch of the main house 3 days after Christmas, on a warm December afternoon that smelled of approaching rain. She walked up the stone path with a tight heart, still not used to the twist of fate, still expecting that this was a dream from which she would wake back to cruel reality. "Mrs. Marianne," Edward began when she arrived, this time offering a chair and waiting for her to sit before continuing. "I have a proposal to make. The estate needs someone to organize the main house, to take care of domestic administration, to supervise the cleaning and maintenance. Miss Amelia is an excellent cook, but she is getting too old to handle everything alone." He paused, measuring his words. "You were a teacher before marrying. That means you know how to read, write, do arithmetic. These skills are rare and valuable." Marianne listened with growing attention. Edward continued explaining that the work would involve managing the pantry stock, placing orders with suppliers, supervising workers who did cleaning and repairs, organizing household documents. It wasn't manual labor that would break her physically. It was work that would use her intelligence, skills she had developed when she still had another life. The salary would be 3 times what Vincent earned as a carpenter. She could work during the day while the children played in the yard under Miss Amelia's supervision. She would always be close to them. Marianne couldn't believe what she was hearing. That would be, she began with a choked voice. That would be more than I could dream of, Mr. Edward. I accept with much gratitude. I will do the best job possible, I promise. Edward nodded, satisfied, but also relieved in a way he himself didn't fully comprehend. Excellent, he said. You can start on Monday. Today is Thursday. That gives you a few days to organize yourself and rest. But Marianne didn't rest. In the following 3 days, she cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, washed all the clothes, sewed patches, prepared for the new role with a dedication that bordered on reverence. It wasn't just a job. It was a fresh start. It was dignity recovered. It was a future where before there was only an abyss. The children felt the change in the air. Daniel smiled more. Julia hummed all the time. Peter, who was still too small to understand, simply reflected the joy around him with frequent giggles. The following Monday, Marianne began working at the main house. Miss Amelia received her with a tight hug and tears in her eyes. "Blessed girl," said the cook, holding Marianne's face between her calloused hands. "God does not abandon a mother who fights for her children. And that man there," she pointed with her head toward the office where Edward worked, "that man has a good heart that he hid for too long. You and those children are going to do him good. You'll see." Marianne didn't fully understand what Miss Amelia meant, but she stored the words away. She began the work with impressive energy. The main house was in a state that shocked Marianne deeply. It wasn't dirty exactly. Miss Amelia kept the kitchen and main areas clean. But it was emotionally abandoned. Whole rooms closed off, accumulating dust and mold, heavy curtains blocking the light. Furniture covered with white sheets like ghosts. Winter gardens that were once beautiful, now taken over by spiderwebs and dead leaves. It was a house that had given up on living along with its owner. Marianne asked Edward for permission to open windows, wash curtains, air out rooms. He hesitated visibly when she mentioned the closed rooms on the 2nd floor, the ones that belonged to Cecily. But after a long pause, he nodded. "Do what you think necessary," he said with a controlled voice. "Just store with care anything personal you find." Marianne promised and followed through. She treated Cecily's memories with the respect of someone who knows grief, folded dresses with care, stored jewelry in lined boxes, preserved photographs in protected albums. Ms. Amelia helped where she could and also told stories. That was how Marianne began discovering who Edward Alistair really was, beyond the hard mask he presented to the world. Miss Amelia told of the boy Edward had been, curious and gentle, who loved horses and books in equal measure. She told of the young man who fell in love with Cecily at a ball in Nashville, how he courted her with poetry and flowers for 6 months until she agreed to marry. She told of the dedicated husband Edward had been, how he built a special greenhouse for Cecily to grow the orchids she loved, how he read to her every night before they slept. And she told of the tragedy. Cecily, 9 months pregnant, Edward traveling to resolve problems with tobacco exports, the maid finding Cecily collapsed in the parlor in a pool of blood, the doctor arriving too late, the baby born dead, Cecily dying of hemorrhage 2 hours later. Edward returning 3 days later to find wife and son buried. "The man was never the same," concluded Miss Amelia, wiping away tears. "He closed his heart and threw away the key. Until you and those children arrived." Marianne absorbed these stories while she worked. She began to understand the pain that molded Edward, to see beyond the coldness to the wounded man beneath. And something began to grow in her chest, first as compassion, then as deep respect, and gradually as something more complex that she wasn't ready to name yet. Tell us in the comments, do you also believe that two people scarred by loss can heal each other? Leave your opinion here, I want to know what you think. Edward, for his part, couldn't avoid noticing Marianne. She was everywhere now, not physically invasive, but definitely present. He heard the sound of her humming softly while polishing the parlor furniture. He saw the care with which she organized his library, respecting the order he maintained. He smelled the scent of lavender she used to perfume the linen closets. The main house was slowly waking from a decade-long sleep, and Edward didn't know if that comforted or terrified him. The children also invaded his life in unexpected ways. Julia had taken a particular affection for him. The girl appeared on the porch where Edward had coffee in the morning, always with some flower she had picked on the way, offering it to him with a radiant smile. "Good morning, Mr. Edward," she would say with her sweet little voice. "I brought this for you." Edward accepted the flowers awkwardly, not knowing what to do with them. Ms. Amelia resolved the dilemma by putting them in small glasses with water on his office windowsill. Daniel was more reserved, but a sharp observer. The boy helped whenever he saw an opportunity. When Edward was fixing a gate that had stuck, Daniel appeared with tools without being called. "Can I help, Mr. Edward?" The landowner, surprised, allowed it. He discovered the boy had a natural knack for manual work, a clear inheritance from his carpenter father. His fingers were deft, his attention focused, his will to learn genuine. Even Peter, the baby, conquered space. Miss Amelia usually looked after him during the morning while Marianne worked, but the boy had discovered that if he cried enough, he got attention. On a particularly difficult day, when Marianne was on the second floor and Ms. Amelia needed to go out to fetch something in the shed, Peter screamed with the force of impressive lungs. Edward, working in the office, tried to ignore it. The crying continued, intensified. Finally, unable to concentrate, Edward went to the kitchen. He found Peter red from crying so much, tears streaming down his chubby little face, arms outstretched, wanting to be held. Edward stood paralyzed. He hadn't held a baby in his arms for more than 10 years, not since that stillborn son he held for minutes before they took him away. But Peter's cry was so desperate, so genuinely anguished, that something stronger than fear won out. Edward picked up the boy awkwardly, with the exaggerated care of someone holding an extremely fragile object. Peter stopped crying instantly. He looked at Edward with those curious and enormous eyes. Then, surprisingly, he smiled. It was a toothless, drooling smile, absolutely dazzling, and something inside Edward Alastair, something that had been frozen for a long time, melted a little more. The baby nestled against his chest, grabbed his index finger with a tiny hand, and Edward felt a wave of protection so intense it almost knocked him over. That was how Marianne found him 10 minutes later when she came down looking for her son. Edward sitting in the kitchen chair, Peter sleeping peacefully in his arms, an expression on the farmer's face that was a mixture of astonishment, tenderness, and something resembling pain. Marianne stopped at the door, heart squeezing at a scene that held unexpected and deep beauty. "I'm sorry, Mr. Edward," she said softly, so as not to wake the baby. "He is very fussy sometimes." Edward looked at her, and for the first time their gazes truly met, not as boss and maid, not as landowner and needy widow, but as two people seeing each other completely. "No problem," replied Edward with a husky voice. He just wanted to be held. Marianne approached to take her son, but Edward hesitated imperceptibly before handing him over. "Let him sleep a little longer," she suggested gently. "Could you stay with him while I finish organizing the pantry?" Edward nodded, incapable of words. That was the first of many small intimacies that began to weave a connection between them. Marianne discovered that Edward liked his coffee strong and very hot in the morning, so she started preparing it personally, the way he preferred. Edward noticed that Mariana had difficulty reaching the high shelves of the pantry, so he installed a step stool she could use safely. They were small gestures, but loaded with mutual consideration. Conversations began gradually. First, it was just work instructions. Edward explaining what he needed, Mariana reporting what she had done. But little by little they expanded. One afternoon, when Mariana was cataloguing the books in his library, she commented on recognizing some titles she had read when she was a teacher. Edward, surprised, asked which ones. She mentioned Hawthorne, Melville, Dickens. They discovered they had similar literary tastes, that both valued the irony of Twain, the romanticism of the poets, the social critique of Dickens. "Do you miss teaching?" Edward's question came unexpectedly one afternoon while he watched her organize documents with meticulous precision. Mariana stopped, considered the answer with honesty. "I do," she admitted. "I liked seeing the children learn. That moment when something clicks and they understand a new concept. It was rewarding in ways I can't explain." She smiled sadly. "But life takes us down paths different from the ones we plan." Edward knew that truth well. "And your children?" he asked. "Do you teach them?" Mariana nodded. "Daniel already reads well and is learning arithmetic. Julia knows her letters and is starting to form words. Peter is still small, but I sing songs and tell stories to him. It's what I can do for now." Edward became thoughtful. Then he said something that surprised him as much as her. "There is a library here full of books no one reads. The children could use them. And if you want to teach any of the workers' children too, I have an empty shed that could be transformed into a schoolroom." Mariana looked at him with wide eyes. "Are you serious?" Edward shrugged, trying to appear casual, but his voice betrayed emotion. "It makes sense. Educated workers are more efficient. It's a pragmatic investment." But both knew it wasn't just that. It was Edward offering Mariana a piece of identity she had lost, an opportunity to be a teacher again, to have a purpose beyond survival. "Thank you," said Mariana, and the gratitude in her voice was deep as a well. "This means more than you imagine." Edward just nodded, uncomfortable with the intensity of the gratitude, but secretly satisfied to have caused that joy that lit up her face. Weeks passed. January brought heavy rains typical of the southern winter, storms that turned paths into rivers of mud. The estate was in a time of intense movement, preparation for the planting season. Edward spent whole days in the fields supervising, dealing with drainage, checking the soil. He returned at nightfall tired, dirty with red clay, muscles aching from physical work he insisted on doing personally despite being the owner. Mariana always had dinner waiting. Nothing elaborate. She wasn't a cook like Miss Amelia, but honest and hearty food. And invariably she served him herself, stayed a few minutes talking about the day while he ate. Edward began to realize that those were the moments he looked forward to most, not just the food, but the company. Her soft voice telling of small events, Julia teaching Peter to walk, Daniel fixing a broken chair, the hen that laid a double yolk egg and became an event. They were trivialities, banalities of daily life that Edward hadn't had for years, and he discovered, to his surprise, that he missed exactly that. Not grand events or intense emotions, but the texture of everyday shared life, knowing that someone cared if he came back wet from the rain, having someone comment that he looked tired and should rest more. The small attentions that weave an intimacy stronger than stormy passion. One night of a particularly violent storm in February, lightning struck too close to the main house, making everything shake. Mariana, who was still finishing work in the pantry, let out a frightened scream. Edward, who was reading in the office, ran to check. He found her pale, hand on her chest, clearly shaken. "Are you all right?" he asked worriedly. She nodded but was trembling. "Sorry, it's silly, but I've been afraid of storms since I was a child." Edward hesitated only a second before guiding her gently to the parlor. "Sit here," he offered, indicating a comfortable sofa. "I'll get tea." When he returned with 2 cups of hot tea that Miss Amelia always kept ready, he sat in the armchair opposite her. They drank in silence, while the storm roared outside, rain beating violently on the windows, thunder shaking the walls. "Vincent was afraid of storms too," said Mariana suddenly, voice distant with memory. "He never admitted it, but I noticed. He would get tense, restless. I used to hold his hand and tell silly stories until the storm passed." She smiled sadly. "What irony that I have fear of the same thing." Edward watched her face illuminated by the candles they had lit when the electric lights flickered out. "How did you meet?" The question slipped out before he could filter it. Mariana didn't seem to mind the intimacy. "He came to fix windows at the school where I taught," she recounted. "Knocked on my classroom door, took off his hat, asked for permission with that politeness that surprised me. I thought he was handsome right away, but more than that, I thought he was kind. True kindness is rare." She continued telling about the courtship that scandalized her family, a teacher from a traditional family with a penniless itinerant carpenter. About the decision to marry anyway, because she loved Vincent more than family approval. About hard but happy years, building a life together from nothing. And about the immense void his death left. A void she was learning to carry without letting it swallow her completely. Edward listened, fascinated. There was courage in that woman that went far beyond physical survival. It was the courage to keep choosing love, hope, life, even after losing so much. When she finished, they sat in comfortable silence. Then Edward, almost without realizing, began to speak too. He told about Cecily in a way he had never told anyone. Not just facts everyone knew, but intimate details. How she laughed, a sound that was pure joy. How she smelled of lavender and lemon. How she had a habit of rearranging the parlor furniture every week, looking for a perfect arrangement she never found. How she talked to the plants in the greenhouse as if they were friends. How her eyes shone when she discovered she was pregnant. How she planned the child's future with hopes so big, so beautiful, so fragile. And he told about the guilt of having traveled when he should have stayed, the guilt of not having been there when she needed him, the guilt of surviving when she and the son didn't survive. "Mariana," he said with a voice cracked from emotion repressed for a decade, "I killed my family choosing business over them. That truth destroys me every day." Mariana put the cup aside, and in a gesture of boldness that surprised both, crossed the distance between sofa and armchair. She knelt in front of him, held his hands between hers. "Edward," she said, looking directly into his eyes with an intensity that didn't allow looking away. "You didn't kill anyone. Tragedy happened. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't anyone's choice. It was just a cruel twist of fate. But I should have been there," he insisted. "You don't know what would have happened if you were," she replied firmly. "Maybe nothing would change. Maybe you would die trying to save her. Maybe you would be destroyed anyway. What I know is that you don't deserve to carry this guilt alone for the rest of your life. They wouldn't have wanted that for you." Edward looked at that woman knelt in front of him, holding his hands with a strength that was an anchor, speaking truths he needed to hear for 10 years. And something inside him, the last barrier of protection, collapsed completely. Tears began to fall, first slowly, then in a torrent. He hadn't cried since the day of the funeral. He had sworn never again to show weakness. But there on that stormy night, with Mariana holding his hands, Edward Alistair finally let the pain out. Mariana didn't let go of his hands. She didn't say everything would be all right or offer empty comforts. She just stayed there, a solid and compassionate presence, letting him feel without judgment. When the sobs finally calmed, Edward looked at her with red eyes and saw something that frightened and attracted him in equal measure. He saw deep understanding. He saw respect. He saw tenderness. And he saw, too, a reflection of what he himself was feeling, that intense connection that had been growing between them, undeniable and terrifying. "Sorry," he murmured, wiping his face with his hands. "That was inappropriate." "It wasn't," replied Mariana softly. "It was human. You have the right to be human, Edward." It was the first time she called him just by his name, without the formal Mr. The sound of the name in her mouth caused a shiver down his spine. The storm had passed without them noticing. The silence left was just the sound of light rain drumming on the shingles. Mariana was still kneeling, hands still holding his, faces dangerously close. Edward saw her eyes drop to his lips for a fraction of a second before returning. He saw the blush rise on her cheeks. He felt his own breathing accelerate. "Mariana," he said with a husky voice, But he couldn't finish because he didn't know what to say, how to name what he was feeling. She seemed to understand anyway. She stood up slowly, creating necessary distance. "It's late," she said with a voice that also trembled slightly. "I need to get back to the children. Daniel gets worried when there's a storm." "Of course," agreed Edward, standing up too. "I'll ask someone to walk you with a lantern." "No need," she replied. "I know the path with my eyes closed now. But thank you for everything, for listening to me, for trusting me." Edward just nodded, not trusting his voice. Mariana went to the door, took the shawl she had left on the hook. At the door, she turned. "Edward," she said, that connection between them still vibrating in the air like a plucked instrument string. "You are not alone. Not anymore. Remember that." And she went out into the night, leaving Edward standing in the parlor with a heart beating so hard it seemed everyone on the farm could hear. That night changed everything between them. In the following days, there was a new awareness when they met. Glances that lasted a second too long, hands that touched accidentally when passing documents and lingered to separate, smiles that were just for each other, private and significant in ways third parties didn't understand. Ms. Amelia noticed everything and approved silently. She saw the boss smiling more, shoulders less tense, expression less hard. She saw Mariana humming while working, lighter movement in her steps, new shine in her eyes. The cook prayed every night, giving thanks because love was being born in that house that had been a mausoleum for too long. But not everything was rosy. The farm community began to notice too, and some comments weren't kind. Women whispered that Mariana was taking advantage, that she had calculated everything from the start, that she used the children to hook a rich farmer. Men made jokes about the hot widow and the lonely boss, the gratuitous malice of bored people seeking entertainment in others' lives. Daniel heard comments when going to fetch water at the common well. Two workers were talking, not noticing the boy behind the wall. "Bet she's already in his bed," said one with a dirty laugh. "Young widow doesn't last long alone. And him, poor guy, has been needy for years," the other agreed, adding vulgar details that made Daniel clench his fists with rage. The boy returned home visibly disturbed. Mariana noticed immediately. "What happened, my son?" Daniel hesitated, not wanting to repeat what he heard, but needing to vent. He told with a low voice, omitting the coarser parts but keeping the essence. Mariana felt a wave of humiliation and anger. She knew gossip existed, but hearing that it reached her son's ears was different. She sought out Edward the next day, found him in the office reviewing farm accounts. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door. Edward immediately perceived the seriousness. "Did something happen?" Mariana took a deep breath. "They are talking about us," she said. "The workers, the women, making assumptions, unpleasant ones. and the children are hearing it." Edward felt anger rise like a tide. "Who?" he asked with a dangerous voice. Marianne shook her head. "It doesn't matter who. It matters that it's happening. And it matters that I need to think of the children. They have already been through a lot. I cannot allow them to be subjected to humiliation because of me." "What are you saying?" Edward's question came out more abrupt than he intended. Marianne looked at him with eyes full of pain. "I am saying that perhaps I should find employment elsewhere. At some farm where there are no complications." Edward stood up abruptly. "No," he said firmly. "You are not going anywhere." He walked to her, stopped too close to be appropriate, but too far to satisfy what he really wanted. "Marianne," he said with an intense voice, "I don't care what they are talking about. Gossip is the poison of small people with empty lives. You know what exists between us. I know what exists between us. That is what matters." She looked at him with wide eyes. "And what exists between us, Edward?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Edward knew the next words would define everything. He could retreat to safety, deny the connection, maintain the distance that protected but also imprisoned. Or he could be brave, for the first time in 10 years, risk the heart he had sworn to keep locked, admit the truth that had been growing undeniable. "Love," he replied simply. "What exists between us is love, Marianne, and I won't allow malicious gossip to destroy that before we even have a chance to discover what we can be together." Her previous words echoed in his mind. True kindness is rare. So he let himself be kind, let himself be vulnerable, let himself love finally. Marianne felt tears fill her eyes. "Edward," she whispered, I feel the same. But what about the children and your reputation? And—" "I don't care," he interrupted. "None of that matters if it means losing you. For the first time in a long time, I want a future. I want to build something new. And I want that with you, with Daniel, with Julia, with Peter. I want you all in my life, not as temporary employees, but as family." The declaration was bold, premature by most standards, but absolutely sincere. Marianne took a step toward him, then another, until they were so close their breaths mixed. Edward raised his hand slowly, gave her time to pull away if she wanted. She didn't pull away. He touched her face with reverent delicacy, traced the jawline, caressed the cheek where a tear rolled down. "May I?" he asked, asking permission, respecting her autonomy, even in the midst of all the emotion. Marianne nodded, wordless, because her throat was closed with feeling. Edward leaned in slowly and kissed her. It was a soft kiss, almost chaste, lips touching with tenderness that carried a promise of future depth. It was Edward's first kiss in 10 years and Marianne's first kiss in 6 months, and it was perfect in its honest simplicity. When they separated, both were trembling. Edward rested his forehead on hers, eyes closed, just feeling the proximity, the reality of the moment. "I will fix this," he promised. "I will make it clear to everyone on the farm that you have my respect and my protection, and when appropriate time passes, when we are certain, I will make this official in every possible way." Marianne understood. He was talking about marriage, about a concrete future, not just a clandestine romance, but he also had the sensitivity to know it was too soon, that she still carried recent grief, that they needed time to build a solid foundation. "Thank you," she said, "for understanding, for respecting, for being patient." Edward kissed her forehead. "I have a whole life ahead now," he said. "I can be patient." The next day, Edward gathered all the farm workers in the yard. It was Sunday morning, sun already hot, promising a scorching day. Everyone came curious, wondering what kind of announcement the boss would make. Edward stood on the porch of the main house, an elevated position ensuring everyone saw and heard him. "I have heard," he began with a voice that carried natural authority but also contained rage, "that some people on this estate have too much time and enough lack of character to spread malicious gossip about Mrs. Marianne Cross." Absolute silence fell over the crowd. Edward continued with eyes scanning every face. "Let me make some things crystal clear. Mrs. Marianne is an exemplary employee of this estate, hired for her skills and competence. Any suggestion to the contrary is an insult to her and to me." He paused, letting words settle. "If anyone here has a problem with her presence, my door is open to settle final accounts, and that person can seek employment elsewhere. This estate has no room for disrespect, especially not against a widowed woman caring for 3 small children. Anyone else I hear spreading rumors will be dismissed immediately without a letter of recommendation." "Understood." Murmurs of agreement ran through the crowd. Some seemed genuinely ashamed, others just intimidated. But the message was received clearly. Edward Alistair had placed Marianne under explicit protection, and challenging the landowner on his own land was professional suicide. Marianne watched from afar, from the corner of the kitchen where she stayed with Miss Amelia. She felt a complex emotion mixing gratitude, relief, and also concern, because Edward had exposed himself so publicly. "That man," whispered Miss Amelia beside her, "that man is completely in love with you, girl, and that is a blessing few receive twice in a life." The following months were of careful and delicious growth. Edward and Marianne built a relationship with rare patience, respecting boundaries, allowing emotional intimacy to grow before physical. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. They discovered surprising affinities and differences that complemented them. He was pragmatic, she idealistic. He thought in numbers and efficiency, she in people and connections, but both valued honesty, loyalty, family. The children blossomed under Edward's growing attention. Daniel became an unofficial apprentice, following the farmer around the property, absorbing knowledge about rural administration, tobacco, cattle, land. Edward discovered pleasure in teaching, in passing on wisdom he had accumulated. Julia had completely conquered his heart. The girl called him Uncle Edward now, and he melted every time she ran to hug him when he arrived from the fields. Peter, growing fast, started taking his first wobbly steps, going to Edward with chubby laughs. In April, when the tobacco seedlings were being transplanted, Edward made an important decision. He sought out Reverend Justin in the village, a man he had known since childhood. "Reverend," said Edward, sitting in the simple parlour of the parsonage, "I came to ask for counsel. But I think I already know the answer." Reverend Justin, a man of 68 with completely white hair and kind eyes, smiled. "About the widow Marianne, I imagine." Edward wasn't surprised the preacher already knew. Small towns keep no secrets. "Yes," he confirmed. I fell in love with her, Reverend, deeply, and I want to marry when her time of mourning respectfully permits. I came to ask how long is appropriate to wait." The preacher studied the farmer's face. "By custom, a widow waits a year before marrying again," he explained. "But by the law of the heart and the grace of God, every situation is unique." He leaned forward. "Edward, I have known you your whole life. I saw you close your heart when Cecily died. I saw you become a shadow of the man you were. Now I see life returning to your eyes. That is a miracle that should not be delayed unnecessarily." The preacher continued, saying that in normal circumstances he would recommend the full wait of a year, but Marianne's circumstances weren't normal. She was in a vulnerable situation, dependent on Edward's protection in ways that marriage would make more secure and appropriate. 6 months is a reasonable time," concluded Reverend Justin. "September would be adequate. It gives time for grief to be honored, but doesn't extend suffering unnecessarily." Edward left the conversation with clarity of purpose. 6 months meant September of 1928. 5 months away. He could wait. He would use this time to court Mariana appropriately so that Daniel, Julia, and Peter knew him completely, to build a foundation that would sustain a whole life together. The official proposal happened in June, under a centennial oak tree that grew near the creek on the southern border of the estate. Edward had taken Marianne to show her the extent of the property, a horseback ride that had become custom on Sundays when she had time off. They stopped to rest under the generous shade of the tree, drank cool water from the creek, talked lazily about small things. "Marianne," Edward said finally, heart beating so hard it felt like it would burst from his chest. "I have something to ask." She looked at him with curiosity. He took her hands, breathed deep. "I know it hasn't even been a year since Vincent passed. I know you still carry grief, and I respect that deeply. But I also know, with absolute certainty, that I want to pass the rest of my life with you and your children." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a simple but beautiful ring, gold with an aquamarine stone, the color of her eyes. It had been his mother's engagement ring, kept all these years. "Marry me, Marianne?" he asked with a voice choked with emotion. "You don't have to answer now if you aren't ready. I can wait however long you need. But I needed to ask, needed you to know that my intentions are completely honorable and permanent." Marianne looked at the ring, then at the man kneeling in front of her, then back at the ring. Tears streamed freely down her face. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Edward, I want to marry you." The heart took time to bury Vincent, and part of me will always carry love for him. But I have space for new love, different love, but equally true. And that love is yours. Edward placed the ring on her finger with hands trembling with emotion. Then he pulled her into a tight hug, buried his face in her hair, breathed the scent of simple soap and honest work that he had come to associate with home. "I will make you happy," he promised. "You and the children. I will spend the rest of my life earning this second chance life is giving me." They set the wedding for September, 5 months later. Marianne wanted a simple ceremony, just close family and closest friends. Edward agreed completely. They didn't need ostentation or spectacle. They needed only sincere commitment witnessed by God and the people they loved. The children received the news with explosive joy. Julia jumped so much she almost fell. Daniel smiled that rare smile of his that lit up his whole face. Peter, without fully understanding but capturing the happiness around him, clapped hands and laughed. "Are we going to be a real family?" asked Julia with shining eyes. "We already are a real family," replied Edward, picking the girl up, "but now it will be official for the whole world to see." He had thought carefully about this. "Edward, are you going to be our father now?" The question came from Daniel, a serious boy who needed clarity. Edward knelt to get to the boy's height. "Look, Daniel," he began, choosing words with care. "Your father was Vincent. He loved you very much and will always be your father. No one will take that from you, not even me. But if you allow me, I would like to be a father too, to take care of you, teach you, protect you. Can there be space for 2 fathers in the heart?" Daniel considered this seriously, then nodded. "Yes, there can," agreed the boy. "And can I call you Pa?" "You can," replied Edward with a choked voice. "If you call me Pa, deal." "Deal," said Daniel. And for the first time since they met, the boy hugged the man spontaneously, a tight and sincere hug that sealed something deep between them. The months until September passed too fast and too slow at the same time, a paradox known by all who wait for an important moment. Edward used this time to transform not just his life, but the whole structure of the farm. He hired a lawyer from Nashville to begin the formal adoption process for the 3 children. He wanted Daniel, Julia, and Peter to carry his legal surname, to have all the rights of legitimate children, for there never to be doubt about their belonging to the Alistair family. Marianne continued working in the main house, but now with a different purpose. She wasn't a maid preparing a boss's house anymore. She was a bride preparing what would be her home. She chose new curtains with care, reorganized furniture imagining where children would play, planned how to transform empty rooms into spaces full of life. Ms. Amelia helped with the enthusiasm of someone finally seeing an old dream coming true. Edward had the room that would be his and Marianne's completely renovated. It was a large room on the second floor, with windows facing east, where the morning sun entered softly illuminating everything with golden light. It had been a guest room in Cecily's time, never the marital room he shared with his first wife. This choice was deliberate, and Marianne appreciated the sensitivity. They wouldn't have to compete with ghosts of the past. They would build new memories in a new space. The room was painted white with pale blue accents. They bought a new bed, wide and comfortable, with a carved wooden headboard that a village carpenter took 3 weeks to make. A spacious wardrobe where her clothes would have as much place as his. A dresser with a mirror where she could comb her hair in the morning. A soft rug that would warm bare feet on cold Tennessee winter mornings. Every detail chosen thinking of shared life, of built intimacy, of a joint future. Rooms for the children were also prepared. Daniel would get his own room for the first time in his life, a space where he could have privacy appropriate for a boy turning into a young man. Edward had a solid desk made where Daniel could study, a shelf for books the boy devoured faster and faster, a comfortable single bed. The walls were painted light green, a color Daniel chose because it reminded him of the fields. Julia and Peter would share a large room decorated with joy reflecting the girl's spirit. Walls yellow like the sun, curtains with embroidered flowers Marianne had made personally, a small bed for Julia and a reinforced crib for Peter, who was growing too fast. Toys Edward had bought on a trip to Nashville, porcelain dolls for Julia, painted wooden horses, building blocks, simple but significant luxuries for children who had had so little. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, fundamental. Green Hope Estate was waking from prolonged mourning, returning to be a place of life, laughter, true hope that justified the name. Workers commented on the change. The boss smiled now, greeted people by name, asked about their families. The main house had lights on at night, where before there was only darkness. Sounds of children playing echoed where before there was only silence. Reverend Justin visited several times during these months for premarital counseling sessions. He sat with Edward and Marianne in the parlor, drank coffee Ms. Amelia served, talked about expectations, challenges, commitments of marriage. He spoke about the importance of honest communication, of respecting differences, of building a shared spiritual life. He reminded Edward he would be a stepfather, a role requiring special patience and wisdom. He reminded Marianne that Edward carried deep scars that would need continuous care. But mostly, Reverend Justin celebrated the love between them. He saw how they looked at one another with a mixture of passion and tenderness, desire and respect. He saw how they touched with reverent care, as if each was a precious gift. He saw how they built a solid foundation, not just on attraction, but on genuine friendship, true partnership. "You two," said the preacher with a satisfied smile, "have been blessed with a rare second chance. Honor that by treating each other and the children with love that reflects God's love." August arrived, bringing drier weather, red dust rising from the paths with every step, an implacable blue, cloudless sky. It was the month of final preparation for the tobacco harvest that would start later. Edward worked long hours, ensuring everything was ready. But he always returned to dine with Marianne and the children, a ritual that had established itself as sacred. They ate together in the big kitchen, not in the formal dining room Edward considered too cold for family. Julia told elaborate stories about imaginary adventures. Daniel recounted what he learned during the day, knowledge absorbed with impressive thirst. Peter made glorious messes with food, dirtying face and hands and everything around, laughing that laugh that was pure, unfiltered joy. Edward participated in conversations, asked genuine questions, was truly interested. Marianne watched these interactions with a heart so full it sometimes physically hurt from so much love. At night, after the children slept, Edward and Marianne sat on the main house porch. He smoked an occasional cigar. She embroidered the trousseau she was preparing for the wedding. They talked about future plans, about the farm, about the children's education, about the life they would build together. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, just appreciating each other's company, sound of crickets singing in the darkness, gentle breeze bringing scent of earth and curing tobacco. Edward started touching Marianne more freely, not inappropriately, but with growing affection. Held her hand while they walked, put his arm around her shoulders when they sat together, kissed her forehead when saying goodbye every night. Kissed her lips too, kisses starting chaste, but deepening gradually as trust and desire grew. They maintained appropriate boundaries because the wedding hadn't happened yet, but anticipation made every touch loaded with promise. Marianne corresponded with equal intensity, caressed his face when they talked, interlaced fingers with his, nestled against his chest when they sat on the porch, listening to the strong and constant heartbeat that calmed her in inexplicable ways. Felt desire grow, that low heat in the belly she had known with Vincent, but thought she would never feel again. It was good to know she wasn't dead emotionally, that body and heart could awaken again to love and passion. The first week of September arrived, bringing the first signs of autumn. Trees were turning vibrant shades of orange and red. The air had the smell of change, of beginnings. It was the perfect moment for a wedding that symbolized exactly that. Restart, renewal, new life born from ashes of old losses. Marianne sewed her own wedding dress with Miss Amelia's help. It wasn't white, because a widow didn't use white, but pale blue like a clear autumn sky, a colour that favoured her immensely. The fabric was fine cotton, but of good quality Edward insisted on buying. The cut was simple, modest, appropriate for a small ceremony, but beautiful in a way that made Marianne look years younger. Long sleeves, high collar, cinched waist, skirt flowing to the ankles. Miss Amelia embroidered tiny flowers on the collar and cuffs, delicate work taking weeks. Edward had a new suit made at a tailor in Nashville, dark, light wool fabric, impeccable cut accentuating broad shoulders and upright posture, starched white shirt, discreet vest, silk tie. Leather shoes polished until they shone. He wanted to be worthy, wanted Marianne to be proud, walking down the chapel aisle toward him. The children also got new clothes. Daniel would wear a small suit similar to Edward's, the first formal clothes of his life. Julia would have a pink dress with ribbons and lace, every 6-year-old girl's dream. Peter would wear navy blue overalls with suspenders, impossible to look more adorable. Edward ordered everything in advance, certifying the whole family would be dressed appropriately. On the eve of the wedding, Edward went to sleep at one of the foreman's houses, a tradition dictating the groom shouldn't see the bride on the wedding day before the ceremony. He said goodbye to Marianne on the porch, held her face between hands, looked deep in her eyes. "Tomorrow," he said with a voice hoarse from emotion, "tomorrow you become my wife. Tomorrow we start a new life together. Are you ready?" "More than ready," she replied, smiling through happy tears. "I've been waiting for this so long without knowing." Edward kissed her deeply, a kiss promising everything to come, all future nights and mornings, all shared life ahead, then, with visible effort, pulled away. "Until tomorrow, my love," he said. "Until tomorrow, my heart," she replied. The morning of September 15th, 1928, dawned perfect. Blue sky without clouds, bright sun but not scorching, gentle breeze bringing scent of flowers and good earth. Marianne woke early, nervous and excited in equal measure. Miss Amelia and 2 women from the farm came to help her get ready, bathed her in a tub with rose-scented water, combed her hair into an elegant bun adorned with fresh jasmine flowers, helped her dress in the blue dress falling perfectly over modest curves. Put on the engagement ring Edward gave, aquamarine, sparkling in morning light. When Marianne looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman she saw. Not a desperate widow living day to day anymore. She was a radiant bride about to marry a man she loved, about to give her children security and a future, about to start a completely new chapter. Tears threatened to smudge the little makeup Miss Amelia applied, but Marianne blinked firmly, forcing them back. Today was a day for joy, not tears. The children were dressed with similar care. Daniel was serious in the new suit, trying to look like a little man, but eyes betraying emotion. Julia twirled in the pink dress, making the skirt spin, enchanted with her own appearance. Peter, who had just turned 2, was adorable but also restless, little interested in standing still and looking pretty when there was so much to explore. The ceremony would be at noon in the estate chapel, a small but charming building Edward's grandfather built in 1850. Capacity for maybe 50 people seated tight, but there wouldn't be that many. Edward invited only the oldest and most loyal workers. Marianne didn't have family to invite, a reality hurting a little, but she accepted. Reverend Justin would officiate, of course, even having passed 70 and legs not so firm anymore. At 11:30, Marianne and the children left the main house toward the chapel, walked slowly down the stone path Edward ordered cleaned and decorated with wildflowers. Workers passing by stopped to watch, took off hats in respect, smiled with genuine approval. The transformation witnessed in recent months conquered even the most skeptical. Impossible to deny happiness radiating from that family, about to formalize itself. Edward was already in the chapel, waiting at the altar, with hands clasped behind his back to disguise nervousness. Wearing the new suit, looking impeccable. Grey hair combed with care, face shaved close, smelling of aftershave. But it was the expression on his face that really mattered. Mixture of love, expectation, gratitude, and joy no one had seen for over a decade. When Marianne entered the chapel, arm in arm with Daniel because the boy insisted on being the one to give her away, Edward felt his heart stop for a beat before accelerating violently. She was beautiful in a way going beyond physical appearance, radiant with inner light coming from true happiness, renewed hope, requited love. Walked slowly down the narrow aisle, smiling at him with shining eyes, and Edward knew with absolute certainty he was making the right choice, that life was giving a second chance he didn't deserve, but for which he was eternally grateful. Marianne reached the altar. Daniel gave her hand to Edward with touching seriousness, went to sit beside Julia and Peter in the front pew. Reverend Justin began the ceremony with a voice trembling slightly from emotion because he knew both for a long time, knew the depth of journeys bringing them there. Spoke about love overcoming loss, about second chances, about family built not just of blood, but of choice and commitment. Moment for vows arrived. "Edward," said Reverend Justin, "repeat after me." Edward held Marianne's hands, looked deep in her eyes, repeated ancient words sounding new in his mouth. "I, Edward Alistair, take thee, Marianne Cross, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." His voice cracked on some words, because emotion was too big to contain completely. Marianne repeated vows with clear and firm voice. "I, Marianne Cross, take thee, Edward Alistair, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." She squeezed his hands, transmitting through touch everything words couldn't express completely. Reverend Justin blessed the rings, simple gold bands Edward bought. Edward placed the ring on Marianne's finger, with hands trembling slightly. Marianne placed the ring on his finger with a smile so bright it lit up the chapel interior. "By the power vested in me," declared Reverend Justin with evident satisfaction, "I pronounce you husband and wife. Edward, you may kiss your bride." Edward pulled Marianne gently, leaned in and kissed her. It was a deep but respectful kiss, appropriate for a sacred place, but loaded with promise of future intimacies. Modest applause erupted from pews where witnesses watched. Julia clapped excitedly. Daniel smiled that rare smile. Peter tried to imitate applause with fat little hands, without enough coordination yet. If you are loving this true love story, leave your like now, and stay until the end, because there is still much more emotion coming. After the ceremony, there was a modest celebration in the main house yard. Ms. Amelia had prepared a banquet with help from other farm women. Roast chicken, smoked ham, rice, black-eyed peas, cornbread stuffing, potato salad, fresh breads, varied sweets. There was a 3-tier cake Ms. Amelia spent days decorating with white icing and sugar flowers. Music played by skilled workers with guitar, banjo, harmonica. Spontaneous dancing started shyly, but soon filled the space with joy. Edward danced the first dance with Marianne, a clumsy waltz because neither was an experienced dancer, but beautiful in its sincerity. Then danced with Julia, who stood on the tips of her toes on his shoes, laughing while he spun her. Invited Daniel too, teaching the boy basic steps with the patience of a true father. Held Peter in arms and pretended to dance, making the baby giggle with the swaying. Marianne danced with old workers who supported her in difficult moments. Hugged Miss Amelia so tight, almost suffocated the cook, thanking for everything she did. Talked with farm women coming to greet, some of the same who spread gossip months ago, but now seemed genuinely happy for the couple. The party continued until the sun began to set. Then, per tradition, Edward and Marianne said goodbye to guests and retired to the main house. The children would stay with Miss Amelia that first night, giving newlyweds appropriate privacy. Daniel understood and accepted. Julia was less convinced, but promised to be a good girl. Peter probably wouldn't notice much difference provided he had food and attention. Edward led Marianne by the hand up the wide staircase to the second floor, walking down the hall to the room they prepared together. He opened the door, and before she could enter, picked her up in his arms. Marianne let out a surprised laugh. "What are you doing?" she asked, holding his neck. "Tradition," replied Edward with a smile. "Groom carries bride over the threshold, brings luck." She laughed again and let herself be carried, feeling his strong muscles holding her with ease. Inside the room, Edward set her down gently. Stood facing each other, suddenly shy despite all time spent together. Different now, were husband and wife. Had right and blessing for complete intimacy, but weight of expectation, of wanting it to be perfect, created tension. Marianne broke silence first. "I'm nervous," admitted with low laugh. "It's silly. I've been married before, but—" "I'm nervous too," interrupted Edward softly. "Also been married before, but this is different. You are different. We are different." He approached, touched her face. "We don't have to rush, Marianne. We have a whole life ahead." She relaxed with his words, with patience and consideration he always demonstrated. Kissed him then. Kiss starting soft but deepening quickly as inhibitions melted. Hands began to explore, first hesitant, then more confident. Clothes removed slowly, each piece revealing skin waiting to be touched, known, loved. Edward kissed every inch of skin he discovered, adoring her body with reverence going beyond physical desire. Marianne responded with equal fervor, hands tracing his muscles, lips following trail hands opened. When finally united, it was with tenderness and passion in equal measure, two bodies learning one another, two souls intertwining completely. Later, lying entangled between messed sheets, Edward held Mariana against his chest, fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "I love you," he said with husky voice. "Love you in ways I didn't even know were possible. Thank you for giving me this chance, for letting me love you and the children, for making me want to live fully again." Marianne kissed his chest where heart beat strong and constant. "I love you too," she replied, "and there is nothing to thank. We saved each other, my love. That is what true love does." The following months were of adjustment and joy. Marianne moved officially to the main house with all children. Daniel was enchanted with his own room. Julia decorated hers and Peter's space with creative enthusiasm. Peter was just happy to be near family, following Edward through house with wobbly steps, calling him Pa with that adorable small child pronunciation. Edward formalized adoption in October, took papers to the Nashville courthouse, signed documents making Daniel, Julia and Peter legally his children. Daniel Edward Alistair, Julia Marie Alistair, Peter Vincent Alistair, keeping biological father's name as middle name in honor of man who sired him. When returned with new certificates, called children to office. "You are Alistairs now," announced with pride, not trying to hide. "Officially, legally, permanently, are my children in every way that matters." Daniel held new certificate with trembling hands. Julia didn't fully understand implication, but knew it was important and special. Peter was more interested in tearing paper, but Marianne stopped him laughing. Family reconstituted, legalized, sanctified. No longer widow and orphans depending on kindness of strangers. Were Alistairs one of respected families of region, with all rights and privileges that guaranteed. Edward returned to smiling regularly, things surprising even himself. Laughed at Julia's antics, discussed literature with Daniel reading as voraciously as he did in youth, played with Peter in way would have seemed impossible months ago, and loved Marianne with intensity growing instead of diminishing as time passed. Wasn't honeymoon passion burning hot but fast? Was deep love built on solid foundation of mutual respect, shared values, unshakable commitment? Marianne blossomed in ways going beyond marital happiness. Edward kept promise about school. Renovated shed transforming into proper classroom, bought desks, blackboard, books, materials, hired Marianne officially as teacher, not just for their children, but for all farm and region children wanting to learn. She started with 12 students. In 6 months, had 25. Reputation as dedicated and competent teacher spread, bringing families from neighboring farms. Teaching again gave Marianne peace of identity she thought lost forever. Wasn't just wife and mother, much as she loved roles, was also educator, woman with purpose beyond domestic sphere, person making tangible difference in young lives. Saw poor children learning to read, opening doors of opportunity closed otherwise. Felt deep satisfaction coming from fulfilled vocation. Miss Amelia watched everyone's transformation with wise matriarch satisfaction. "I knew it," said frequently. "Knew since that Christmas God had planned for you. Just needed courage to accept." Edward hugged old Cook, thanking for remaining faithful during dark years, for keeping hope when he lost it, for being bridge between past and future. In March 1929, Marianne discovered she was pregnant. News left her simultaneously joyful and apprehensive. Joyful because Edward's child would be physical confirmation of their love, living symbol of union. Apprehensive because she was 32, not so young anymore, and pregnancy always carried risks she knew too well. Told Edward one night after children slept. "We're on porch, favorite place for important conversations." "Edward," said, taking his hand, "I have something to say. Going to have baby. We are going to have baby." Edward stood paralyzed for 3 complete heartbeats. then turned to her with wide eyes. "Baby," repeated as if not sure heard correctly. "Our baby." Marianne nodded, watching reaction with care, not knowing how ghosts of previous pregnancy would affect response. But Edward surprised her, face lit up with pure joy, no shadows. Lifted her from chair, spun her in air, laughing like she never seen. "A baby," repeated. "We're going to have a baby. Marianne, this is—" Have no words. Kissed her deeply, hands trembling with emotion. But later, when initial euphoria settled, worry surfaced. Marianne saw change in expression. "What is it?" asked. Edward hesitated. "Cecily died in childbirth," said softly. "I couldn't bear losing you, too. Promise you'll be careful, that we'll do everything right this time." Marianne held his face between hands. "We'll take every care possible," promised. "And you will be here with me during everything, not traveling. We will face this together." Edward hired best doctor from Nashville to monitor pregnancy. Dr. Mendez was man of 50 with vast experience and excellent reputation. Traveled to farm monthly to examine Marianne, verify everything progressing normally, prescribed vitamins, adequate diet, sufficient rest. Edward followed recommendations religiously, sometimes exaggerating protection. To point, Marianne laughed gently at him. Children received news with varied enthusiasm. Daniel, now 9, understood implications and was genuinely happy for little brother or sister coming. Julia was ecstatic, already planning how to help care for baby, what clothes would sew, what songs sing. Peter, with 2.5 years, didn't understand completely, but captured excitement and was happy too. Pregnancy progressed well. Marianne had morning sickness first months, but nothing severe. Belly grew round and prominent. Baby kicked hard, especially at night, making Marianne laugh and complain in equal measure. Edward placed hand on her belly every night, feeling movements of life they created together, marveled and grateful, and still little scared. In November, when chill of autumn began to deepen, Marianne went into labor. Was Tuesday dawn, 3 weeks before predicted date, but within normal margin. Edward woke with her shaking him. "It's time," said Marianne with calm voice despite pain starting. "Baby is coming." Edward went into controlled panic. Got up stumbling, lit lantern, sent worker to fetch Dr. Mendez in village, where he was staying waiting exactly for this moment. Ms. Amelia assumed command with efficiency of one who witnessed many births. Prepared room, hot water, clean towels, everything necessary. Kept Edward occupied, so he wouldn't go crazy with worry. Cared for children waking with movement, explaining soon would have little brother or sister but needed stay calm and let mama rest. Doctor Mendez arrived hour later, examining Marianne with reassuring professionalism. "Progressing well," announced. "Baby in correct position. Should be born in next hours." Edward asked if could stay in room. Dr. Mendez hesitated. Not common husbands assist births, but seeing determination in farmer's face, agreed. "Just don't faint," warned. Labor lasted 6 hours. Were 6 hours of pain for Marianne, of anguished helplessness for Edward. Held her hand during contractions, wiped sweat from forehead, murmured encouragements barely making sense. Marianne squeezed hand with strength, leaving marks later, screamed when pain got too intense, breathed with determination between contractions. Finally, when sun high in November sky, baby born. Was girl, small but perfect, with strong lungs announcing arrival, with vigorous cry. Dr. Mendez cut cord, cleaned baby with warm towel, placed on Marianne's chest, crying relief and joy. Edward looked at daughter with expression of complete astonishment. "It's a girl," said Dr. Mendez unnecessarily because obvious. "Healthy and strong. Congratulations." Edward touched daughter's dark hair with trembling finger. "She is perfect," whispered with choked voice. "Completely perfect. Marianne, you are incredible. Thank you. Thank you for this." Kissed wife's forehead with infinite tenderness, then daughter's forehead with reverence. First time holding live baby, his own baby, was like healing wound carried for 12 years. Didn't erase memory of son lost, but created new memory of fulfilled hope, celebrated life, guaranteed future. Isabella Cecily Alistair, named in honor of Edward's first wife and carrying name as blessing instead of shadow, grew surrounded by abundant love. Daniel, Julia, and Peter adored her, competed for who held her, who made her laugh, who played with her. Ms. Amelia pampered shamefully. Edward was completely transformed father, present and attentive in ways surprising all who knew before. Years following were of prosperity and happiness. Greenhope Estate became more productive under Edward's administration, having renewed motivation. Tobacco was excellent quality, livestock multiplied, lands well cared for, but more important than financial success was atmosphere of place. Workers treated with justice and respect. Families had adequate housing, decent wages, education opportunities through school, Mariana directed. Farm became model in region, example of how business could be profitable without exploiting people. Mariana continued teaching even after Isabella born, nursed baby between classes, combined motherhood and vocation with skill coming from love for both. School grew so much Edward needed build larger building, 3 classrooms and small but well-stocked library. Children completing basic education there frequently managed continue studies in larger towns, some even Nashville. Was tangible legacy of Mariana's commitment to education. Daniel grew strong and intelligent, dedicated apprentice of father, preparing him eventually manage farm. Julia became beautiful and creative girl with special talent for music Edward cultivated, paying for piano lessons. Peter was joyful and adventurous boy, constantly dirtying, self-exploring every corner of property. Isabella grew radiant, favorite of all but not spoiled to point of ruining, balancing abundant love with firm discipline. In 1932, when Isabella was 3, special celebration happened. Was Daniel's 10th birthday, roughly, but also marked almost 4 years since Edward and Mariana wedding. Had big party at farm, inviting not just workers, but also neighboring farmers, village people, all families whose children studied at school. Was demonstration of how Alistair family integrated completely into community, how respected and loved. During party, Edward made toast, raised glass of wine, waited silence, began speak with voice carrying emotion but also strength. Want thank everyone for being here today, began. But mainly want thank my family. Looked at Mariana standing beside, holding Isabella, Daniel grown and serious, Julia beautiful in new dress, Peter with face dirty from cake. You saved me, said simply. When thought life ended, showed me only new chapter starting. Mariana gave me love when forgotten how accept. Children gave purpose when just existing. This family is greatest blessing man could ask. Looked then at guests. And thank all you for witnessing journey, for supporting, for being part of community. May we continue growing together, helping each other, building better future for children and grandchildren. Cheers! All repeated toast, glasses raised, sincere smiles, celebrating not just birthday, but triumph of love over loss, hope over despair, life over death. Mariana looked at husband with eyes shining happy tears, remembered that Christmas Eve almost 5 years ago when about to be evicted, no future, no hope, just desperate determination protect children. Remembered Edward knocking door, face closed, coming execute sentence. Remembered moment everything changed, when saw children and something in him broke, allowing light enter. Who could imagine planned eviction become start of love story so deep, that Christmas promising be darkest, become catalyst for complete transformation? That hardened farmer and desperate widow find in each other exactly what needed to heal, grow, prosper. Edward took Mariana's hand, interlaced fingers with hers. No words, because didn't need, communication evolved beyond language. She squeezed hand back, smile saying everything, gratitude, love, contentment, promise of all future days passed together. Children played around them, running through decorated yard, laughing with carefree joy of protected and loved childhood. Isabella held doll Julia sewed. Peter tried climb tree despite Mrs. Amelia protests. Daniel talked seriously with neighbor farmer's son about planting techniques. Was seen of domestic normality having extraordinary beauty exactly for being ordinary, everyday, real. Miss Amelia, now 67 and hair completely white, watched from afar with deep satisfaction. Had seen that house go from joyful to dead to joyful again. Had witnessed miracle of love resurrecting souls seeming lost forever. Prayed daily thanks for living enough to see this, to be part, to know house served almost 40 years, finally returned to be true home. Years continued passing. Daniel grew becoming responsible man, eventually assuming farm. Julia became teacher like mother, opening second school on neighboring farm. Peter discovered passion for veterinary medicine, caring for farm animals with impressive dedication. Isabella grew surrounded by older siblings, protecting and parents adoring, confident and happy girl, never knowing poverty or despair marking family beginning. Edward and Marianne aged together with grace. His hair completely white, body less agile, but smile remained constant. Her wrinkles deepened but were wrinkles of laughter, not suffering. Walked together through farm in afternoons, hands interlaced, remembering journey made from strangers to partners to soulmates. Sat on porch watching sunset paint mountains gold and purple, content in shared silence of deep lasting love. In 1947, when Edward was 62 and Marianne 50, learned would be grandparents. Daniel married neighbor farmer's daughter, gentle girl named Teresa. First grandson, born August, strong boy Daniel named Vincent Edward, honoring both grandfathers. Edward held great-grandson, first time tears flowing without shame down wrinkled face. Life continues, said marveled. Despite everything, despite all losses and pains, life stubbornly continues. And continued indeed. More grandchildren came, then great-grandchildren. Green Hope Estate remained prosperous through generations. School Marianne founded became respected institution, eventually evolving complete school serving whole region. Story of Edward and Marianne became local legend, told and retold. Example how love and compassion transform destinies completely. Edward lived until 79, dying peacefully sleeping in 1964 with Marianne beside holding hand. Last breath accompanied by smile, as if seeing something wonderful waiting. Marianne lived 12 more years, surrounded by children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. All fruits of love almost didn't happen. When died at 75 in 1976, last word said was his name, Edward, pronounced with same love felt since that Christmas 1927, when everything changed. Were buried side by side in village cemetery under dogwood tree blooming gloriously every September month of their wedding. Simple but elegant headstones identified who were. Edward Alistair, said one, beloved husband, father, grandfather. Marianne Alistair, said other, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, teacher. But words didn't capture completely significance of lives, legacy left. Because true legacy wasn't carved in stone, was in school continuing educating children decades later, was in prosperous farm administered with justice and kindness through generations, was in numerous descendants carrying values of love, work, compassion Edward and Marianne personified. Was in story told and retold of farmer who went to evict widow on Christmas Eve, but changed completely seeing her with 3 children, choosing compassion over pragmatism, love over convenience, life over emotional death. Was story of second chances embraced with courage, of love born from ashes, of old losses, of family built not just by blood, but by conscious choice and unshakable commitment, of two broken people healing each other, discovering ancient scars can heal when true love applied with patience and dedication. Was story proving simple but deep truth? Sometimes life's greatest blessing comes disguised as most difficult moment. Planned eviction for Christmas Eve became catalyst for love lasting generations. Farmer hardened by loss found redemption, choosing compassion. Desperate widow found not just security, but true deep love. And started because on Christmas Eve 1927, man looked three children in eyes and allowed frozen hearts start melting. Sometimes all need to change completely is courage to feel again, risk loving again, believe second chances not just possible but precious gifts not to be wasted. Green Hope Estate continued carrying name with truth until today, reminding all that hope, even when seems lost, can be reborn in most unlikely and beautiful ways.